And thank you all for coming today. So my goal today is to expose you to the richness of what we call the Dewey ecosystem, perhaps surprise you, spark some interest and inquiry, and I hope generate some ideas for use cases, data transformations, and further research. So I've asked Erin to help me leave some time at the end so we can have a discussion. So my outline, I'm going to talk about what data we have, how we encode the data, how we distribute the data. Can you all hear me? Yes. Okay, great. Some projects we're working on right now, what's in the moment right now on the editorial team. And I'll wrap up with some ideas of ways we can exploit this ecosystem to support discovery, because that's what it's all about, getting further organization and supporting discovery. So I'll start out by describing our data by the way we look at it right now, which is we look at our data in the context of a full edition database. And from that full edition database, we derive, and most recently we've done this by machine-assisted procedures, an abridged view of that data that ends up being the abridged edition. And then we also have two other editions that we take out of this database. One is this 200 religion class separate, which is a special religion edition that's used in church, synagogue, and mosque libraries. And then we have the top levels of the DDC that we make widely available. These are called the DDC summaries. So I thought I'd take this view and show you what happened with the edition, the full edition that was published in 2003 in print and web version, DDC 22 first. So you get a sense of what happens with this database. So DDC 22 was published in 2003 in a print version and a web version. In 2004, there was an abridged version published in print and web. And then there were 4 translations of the full edition, this DDC 22, French, German, Italian, and Swedish. There were 5 translations of the abridged edition, French, Hebrew, Italian, Spanish, and Vietnamese. The religion, separate, came out the year after, 2004. The summaries, those top levels of the DDC, then were exposed in 11 additional languages, the ones that we have here. But some other things happened to the data. Another extraction was taken by Annie Bettery, who is associated with the French book industry and develops a specialized abridgment of the full edition for LIS students and people in the French book industry called the Guide. And it's a customized abridgment of DDC 22, but it's a true abridgment. It's just different than our abridged edition. And then the Germans, when they did their DDC 22, they also took a different look at the top levels of the DDC and took classes, some from subordinate levels, that they needed to organize the national bibliographies of Germany, Switzerland, and Austria. And the reason that this shows up in these other languages is because, let me go backwards. Because in Switzerland, there's 5 official languages. I've lost my cursor, here it is. So there's 5 official languages. So they needed the German for Germany and Austria, but they needed English, French, Italian, and Rhaeto-Romanche for the top levels too, for the descriptors. So last year, we published in print and issued in web form DDC 23. And that we just completed, literally. It arrived in the warehouse in print form 3 weeks ago at OCLC, Abridged Edition 15. So that's just come out. And as soon as that was taken, as soon as that we completed that database, we then took an extraction and built an abridged file for the Indonesians. And I'll say a little bit more about this later. And they're working on an Indonesian translation of Abridged Edition 15 right now. Last week, on March 7th, the Swedish mixed translation of DDC 23, mixed means it's in the vernacular as the basic framework, but some specific classes are ingested directly in English in areas where they decided not to develop it further. And that debuted in the Swedish web Dewey on March 7th, so that's out. The other ones that have actual dates, they're in progress, and the other ones are in planning. So you can see that there's a lot going on right now with this particular set of data. So over the life of Dewey, it's been translated into over 30 languages. So there's a rich data store, but it's only been recently that we've been able to use this data effectively because we're using the same encoding, and I'll get to that in a few minutes. I thought it might be interesting for you to know, though, what do we mean by a translation? So it's a language-independent representation. So this is food and drink in Afrikaans, Chinese, English, and French. 641 means the concept food and drink, no matter how you translate that. But we also operate on principles of interoperability and localization. So when I talk about interoperability, I'm talking about that any particular class is functionally equivalent at the same notational level within the same edition in the same time slice. But there may be expansions, interoperable expansions, needed by the particular language group. So here's a great example where Ravenna province and Ravenna, they mean the same thing in the English language and Italian edition, but in the Italian edition, that's been further expanded here. And this is a logical abridgment. 45471 and 4547 are logical abridgments of everything that you have here. So that's the interoperability. And if you think about it, everything that you have here at 4572 and so on through 4574 can be thought of as part of the scope note of 457. They're both describing the same geographic concept, but there's these interoperable expansions. Likewise, localization. We don't expect people to translate by rote. You're describing a concept, and in the English language edition, we use the National Library, the Library of Congress as our example in the English language edition here, not LAC. But we use, in the Italian edition, they use the library in Florence. In the Norwegian edition, they use the National Library of Norway. And notice different notations, synthesized notation, are associated with those because it's this particular class plus the number from the geographic table. So if we go back, all the way back here, I had the DDC data, I had the translations. The next thing I'm going to talk about are the mappings. So another rich part of this ecosystem are the tremendous number of mappings and crosswalks that exist between Dewey and other controlled vocabularies and classification systems. So if we start on the upper left and roam over to the lower right quadrant, and I have to say as an aside, a colleague in the Office of Research at OCLC, J.D. Shippengrover, did this for me. We originally used this in DC, and so this is the metro view of Dewey. So if you're wondering, Dewey's metro center in this picture, that's a representation here. So Rameau is mapped at a very broad level, at that summary level, the French subject headings. Svenska Ämnesår SAO, that's mapped entirely to Dewey, completely to Dewey. CSH, Canadian Subject Headings, they're selective mapping there. Sears, exhaustively mapped. BISAC, the book industry, subject headings, we've done an exhaustive mapping of those. Agravoc, the FAO, Thesaurus, they just did a mapping at a general level in their linked data environment. MESH is a selective mapping. LCSH, we have editorial mappings, statistical mappings. We have lots of mappings. None are exhaustive. Italian subject headings have Dewey numbers in their authority records. SVD are the German subject headings. They've been exhaustively mapped. Then over in this corner over here are several classification systems. SAB is a Swedish classification system, and that one has always had a conversion table associated with it between SAB and Dewey and is maintained to this date. In Class Web, there's a statistical co-occurrence between LCC and DDC classes based on usage in bibliographic records of assignment by the Library of Congress. Similarly, there is a co-occurrence mapping if you look at Classify with the bibliographic record, and I'll give you a link to Classify if you haven't seen it. It's an experimental service from OCLC Research of LCC and Dewey. And there are actually 3 mappings between UDC and Dewey that I'm aware of. One is done by the Czech National Library, and it was done so that they could do collection analysis using the conspectus because they were using UDC and they wanted to use Dewey to get into the conspectus to do collection analysis. A second one was done by ISUM, a bibliographic utility in Slovenia, and they use it to redirect bibliographic records classified by Dewey to UDC classifiers. And the third one is one we've done ourselves in cooperation with UDC. That is a crosswalk between the representation of religions in the 2 systems, and I'll show that to you later. So we've talked about what data we have, what data are associated with the classification, and now we'll talk a little bit about how we encode our data. So we've had an editorial support system since the mid-'80s, and our original data format was developed to support typesetting, had a lot of print elements, markup in the format. Over time, it also, of course, it was also developed to manage the classification, but it had a strong print focus to it and also editorial management. Our format predated the development of the MARC classification format. And so when LC started to develop the MARC classification format, we participated in that effort, but did not convert to it. And so we had, in the meantime, 3 generations of editorial support systems. We did take one element from the MARC classification format. Well, we've taken several, but one major one, we took the history field, the 685 field, so we could encode history of numbers in our database going back to edition 20, and that was a very good decision. But the rest was still this proprietary format. In around 2007, we decided to move to a web-based client editorial support system, one that would be developed by OCLC. And we did an extensive review leading up to that of various ways of encoding data. And we looked at thesaurus management systems, and none were 100% satisfactory for classification data. And we decided to move to the MARC classification format and MARC authority format. Why? Probably in the bubble in your head you're saying, I'm hearing MARC is dead. Well, the data are well specified. It was created for classification data and authority data. Well specified data. It's an international standard. And most importantly, you can use it to output a variety of other distribution formats. And that was very important to us. So here's the record for 796.334 soccer. And boy, I wish I didn't keep losing there, I've got my cursor. And so here's the classification number, the next level up in the hierarchy, and this is the caption. Soccer, parentheses, association, football. Now, down here are various index terms, map vocabulary, and vocabulary from our relative index. And they're all displayed in this record. And each one, here's an example of the entry for soccer in our own relative index. You can see that in subfield 2, the source is DDCRI. If you look closely here, I don't know if you can see it, but you can also see that there's a couple of BISAC headings. In subfield 2, it says BISAC. And this EM over here is our internal coding for an LCSH heading, and you'd also know that if you were a real MARC geek and knew subfield, that second indicator 0 means LC, but if you're not walking around with that in your head, that's LCSH there. Well, each one of these is linked to a MARC authority record. So we encode all of our relative index terms and mapped headings that we've ingested into our system in the MARC authority format. So this is the relative index entry for soccer, and you'll have to believe me that the 150 is way down here. I think you can see it. But that's soccer, and it has all those 083s are all the additions and projects that relative index term appears in with the Dewey number that it's linked to. And the 550s are the references. So I said one of the things, well-specified data, international standard, but a really important other piece of picking MARC was that it allowed output in a variety of formats. So while we use the MARC classification and authority fields internally, and actually, if you know a lot about OCLC, you know what we really use internally is something called the CDF, the comma data format. So it's a version of MARC in there. But when we push data out, we push it out in MARC XML, and for linked data, RDF SCOS. Those are our two primary distribution formats right now. And MARC is extremely hospitable to those. And so we think, so far we think we've made an extremely good choice. And of course that MARC XML, then each one has further end user transformations. So in the case of the RDF, we can have RDF HTML so people can see what our linked data looks like rather than the RDF SCOS representation. And the MARC XML we use to push out the print volumes. So if any of you have seen DDC 23, that was produced using our print server, and we didn't send it off somewhere. It was just bound by a printer, but we produced that PDF directly from our system. So that's how we encode the data. Then we have a fairly complicated data distribution network. Our editorial support system, we have a centralized distribution server. That distribution server talks to the various translations, and most of the translations, all the translations accept and output our data now in MARC XML. And most of them are using software that was developed by a third party originally for the German translation. Then we have a generic end user in the sense of classifier end user web interface called Web Dewey. And then we have linked data services. So here is a schema, an excerpt of our distribution network. And ESS OCLC is the editorial support system at OCLC. The distribution server is also hosted at OCLC. A record, if we were going to push out that soccer class record, an authority record, and the authority records associated with it, it goes to the distribution server, it goes to the translation systems, and they'll do something with it, but it also goes to our English language web Dewey at the same time. So this is what that record we looked at in the MARC representation looks like in web Dewey. So you see 796.334, it's in its hierarchical context there. It has its complete upper hierarchy and subordinate classes. The notes, the relative index terms, the one we looked at, soccer, this is soccer and association football are the two relative index terms associated with this class. Then we also have the LCSH soccer mapped to this class, and two BISAC headings, the book industry headings mapped to this class, both having to do with soccer. But this same record, the English language MARC classification and authority records that then were pushed out of MARC XML, goes to the Swedish system, the Swedish translation system, and there some things happen. The record, the concept is translated. Concept is translated with that view toward interoperability and localization. It's indexed, and some things may be mapped to it too. So further data may be associated with it. And then it gets pushed back to us, but it also gets pushed to Web Dewey, the Swedish version. So here is, and this is an actual record that I took last week from their system. So here you have the record for football. Now what do you notice first? It doesn't say Soccer Association Football, does it? It's the same concept, but it's like the Vietnam War. We call it the Vietnam War, but it's the American War in Vietnam, but it's the same war. It's that kind of thing. They're not going to translate it word for word and use a term that isn't even useful in a local context. But Soccer Association Football equals football almost everywhere else in the world. And so what happens here is because it is a mixed translation, they've made the decision that every record that has a Swedish language class will have Swedish relative index terms, but they'll also ingest the English language relative index terms, and then they further, organized by Swedish arrangement alphabetization rules, have the English and Swedish terms together as a separate display. Now, down in this corner here are the Svenska Amnesor headings that are associated with this. So remember, we had that LCSH and we had the BISAC headings. Well, here they have 3 headings from their subject heading system associated with this class. Now, the other piece is our linked data services in this distribution network. And I still have this in a broken line because we're just productionizing this. We've had data out as linked data for 2 years now in Dewey.info. We're just productionizing that service hanging off of the distribution service. And so it's not fully productionized yet. So in this distribution server, we have XSLT style sheets that take our data and transform it into RDF SCOS to then push it out to our linked data service. So that's one of the other things that happens at the distribution server end. And just to prove to you, you can't see it here, but I'll blow it up. I just wanted you to see that Dewey really has been in the linked data cloud. You can see it there. So I didn't want you to think that I was just telling you something here. I don't know, how many of you have you seen Dewey.info? Anybody? Okay, we have, remember the DDC summaries, that one extraction that I said were the top levels of Dewey? So we have the DDC summaries out in Dewey.info in 11 languages. And then we also took the assignable numbers from 3 editions of Abridged Edition 14. The English language, the Italian, and the Vietnamese. Now, how did we pick those 3 languages? Well, they were available in the right format. Sometimes decisions are made by format. So our old Dewey.info was taking data in our old ESS/XML format, and those 3 were in that format. So our productionized version is all based off the MARC XML to RDF SCOS, but the RDF SCOS will look the same, but we picked those 3 for that reason. It was opportunistic. But I wanted to show you what happens here. So here we have the Russian, the Swedish, which are just the top levels, but because the Vietnamese has the full abridged version, there are a lot more classes in Vietnamese, English, and Italian in Dewey.info than you'll find in the other languages. And even when I pull up the English, the Italian, and the Vietnamese, there are more classes exposed, in this case, in this particular place, in Vietnamese, because they've ingested these classes from the full edition and brought them into their abridged edition to show a deeper representation of peoples, in Southeast Asian peoples. So remember I said early on when we were talking about the Indonesian translation and that we had extracted it from the abridged edition, but we also did some extraction from the full edition actually to build that database for them. For Indonesia, it's the same thing. They want the peoples of Southeast Asia. They want their full language representation. They want their full literature representation. They want their full history representation, full geographic representation from the full edition. And indeed, they may propose back further interoperable expansions. This is actually their first update since 1976 in Indonesia. So it's a really big thing, and they're really excited to get this out. But it's all going to come back to us again in MARC XML, which is so exciting because that all brings it back into that same data store. So just to show you that we really have RDF SCOS, we're not going to hang around and parse this, but I just wanted you to see that, you know, it's really there. Okay. I thought now that we've talked about the data we have and how we can code it and how we distribute it, I thought it might be interesting for you just to tell you some of the things we're working on right at this moment. So I think this is the first time in my memory that I haven't had a print edition of Dewey up on this slide because, you know, I told you we published DDC 23 last year in print and web, and we published the abridged edition 15 in print a couple of weeks ago. And coming out on the plane yesterday, I made the final review of the expanded index to 200 religion class, which is a print object, but it also will, when we publish it in print, we'll push it out in the web version at the same time because there's some additions to it. And that is actually going to the printer next Tuesday. So I'm not even counting that as projects we're working on right now because that's almost out the door. So these are just a potpourri of things that the editorial team is involved in right now. We have our editorial headquarters are at the Library of Congress. We've been there since 1923. Dewey is owned by OCLC, so we also have people in Dublin, and I have an office in both places, and I don't live either place. So I'm on the road, and I'm a Cisco telepresence person. We do a lot of video conferencing. So we're working on extensions to our linked data services. So not only that productionizing part, I'm not really counting that. What we're thinking about is what are the next great things to do in linked data? Well, as soon as our productionizing is, as soon as it's operational, when I change that dotted line to a full line, we're going to push out all the assignable numbers from the full edition of Dewey. So that's an extension that will just happen automatically. But we've decided that the next three things we're going to do is geocoding. So we're going to associate geo names with our geographic table. That offers a whole slew of other possibilities in discovery. And then we're going to take the opportunity of the mathematics subject classification being available as linked data to associate that with our math schedule, and also bring over ISO language codes as links with ethnologue. So those are the three things we're doing for linked data extensions. We're also working with our Arabic translation team. If you remember way back, it said 2012 for the Arabic translation. That team is headquartered at Bibliotheca Alexandrina in Alexandria. And we're working with them. We've just wrapped up a pretty major update to Islam in religion. Part of that was exposed in DDC 23, and part of that's going to be exposed next week in that new 200 religion class, and that was all the basis for what's going to happen in the Arabic translation too. So now we've turned our sights to working on updating Islamic law. And we're doing this with our Arabic translation team, but also with the European Dewey Users Group. They have a 340 law working group, and we've been working with them for quite some time to improve Dewey, the representation of civil law systems in Dewey, and we're also working with them on this Islamic law update. That will be exposed in the Arabic translation, and it will also be exposed in Web Dewey as well. We have just started a project that we have on a fast track on provenance of metadata. We're looking at, especially in a world where we're looking at categorization using not only human processes, but machine processes, and sourcing data from a wide range of things. How do we encode provenance? So we want to think about agent. We want to think about the process that agent used, the source, the date. And so next Monday morning, we have a video conference with Deutsche National Bibliothek and colleagues at LC and OCLC. And we hope to have a discussion paper in front of MARB for the June ALA and really push this because people desperately need this encoding. I said that we published the abridged edition in print about 3 weeks ago. We never had a large number of subscribers to the web version of it, and we decided that instead of keeping a separate web version of the abridged edition, we would look at ways that we could make an abridged view of Web Dewey. So how many of you, has anybody used Web Dewey in here? A couple of you, okay. On the preference screen, if you turn on segmentation and you have the slashes all of a sudden in numbers and you see these funny little instructions, those give you the abridged version of numbers, but those were always written for National Library appliers. They're not written for people, one person in a school library who's trying to figure out how to make this an abridged number. So we have some ideas about how to do this, and it's not just for the English language edition. It turns out that the Norwegians for many years had their own customized abridgment of Dewey and now are moving to the full edition, and they still want to give their DDK view of the classification. So we are having a webinar with the current subscriber base plus representatives of the National Library of Norway again next Monday to go over this abridged view. And actually at 2 o'clock today, Eastern time, so it's already happened, we had a discussion of some changes to segmentation at the Library of Congress. So this is right in the moment. We're looking at relationships in formalization of relationships in the DDC, again, for machine assignment. project close to my heart, modeling the DDC using general conceptual models, Ferber and Frazad. And finally, user contribution and number building assistant. And I'm going to show you an example of this because this is pretty exciting. It's something we're going to introduce in Web Dewey in May. And it is something that will make sure quality numbers are being assigned to works. It's a number building assistant. But it also gives a path for submission from the community back into that distribution network. So what it does is it parses add notes and other instructions to guide the user. And in the background, as you're building that number, it's building a MARC class record. And it's building a MARC class record that has a synthesized number components field, the 765 field. And then it also has an index prompter, which you could add index terms from Dewey or add your own. And in the background, it's building, it will display those in the class record, add them as displayed of the class record, but it's also building authority records for those as well. And then if you want to submit it, you can just keep these numbers built in your personal copy or your institutional copy or your regional group. But if you want, you can push the button and it goes back through the path to the person responsible for that language instance of Web Dewey. So here's an example of, I don't know why all my examples are in the 790s, but they are. This is an example of building a number for a biography of a mountain climber. So I've got 796.522. I've selected that as my number. And there are no add instructions here. And there are no add instructions here, but you know that anywhere, unless it's prohibited, you can add standard subdivisions for table 1. So when there are no add instructions, the number building assistant knows going to table 1, I'm going to grab this from table 1 and get the bio. I've taken some steps out. I felt like when I was looking at this talk, you know how Apple always has some steps have been removed when they display apps? Trust me, I removed some steps so we can move this along. But, stay with me on this. You're grabbing 092 and all of a sudden there's your built number. And behind it, it's going to be building this MARC classification record. It asks you if you want to add an index term, and you can select index terms here from a pop-up script that are already in the relative index, or you can add your other terms. So here you have the class record that's being built. And I want to point out the 765 field because this is that base number for mountain climbing. And here is the table 1 notation. And then put all together, that's the built number. And you can go off later and look at the specifications for the 765. But this is very powerful to have this. Now, you'll see it in a minute, but there's a parallel field in the bib format that was added a couple of years ago, the 085 field, that exactly parallels the 765 field. And the same way, there's the mountaineering biography authority record that was built. And here is, okay, we're back to that distribution. So if this was being built by somebody using the English language version of Web Dewey, that would come here, it goes into Web Dewey. If you say submit it, it goes through the distribution server back to us. We'll do something with it. It still will display in your local copy, but we might decide to change a couple of relative index terms, update it, map some additional outside headings to it, and push it back out to everybody. So this is really, really exciting. And we've worked very closely with our colleagues at Deutsche National Bibliothek on this. Okay, this is the last part of my talk. And so when we think about organization and the Dewey data, what we're really all about is how can we get more categorized content, and how can we use that categorized content to improve the discovery experience. So I'm going to show you from simple to complex several things about improving the discovery experience, and I hope you'll have more ideas. So, a very simple thing. We have all those BISAC headings, and these are real things. These have been used in real places. We have all those BISAC headings mapped. So what you could do at any place in the stack, saying, here you will find, and put the BISAC headings up there, and have a QR code that would launch a search into your catalog. So that's one very simple thing in physical discovery. Here's a physical and virtual discovery mix, where if you were serving a Spanish language population, we modeled this originally for a library in Paterson, New Jersey that had a large English and Spanish language clientele and had only one computer in the library, but everybody had cell phones. So we did QR codes on this with the top level browsers, and then it took them right into their catalog. I'm showing you here using the API into worldcat.org. And so if I go back here and I point it at 795, it's going to launch a search into worldcat.org into 795, and that will bring up things on games. And I might just decide to pick a book on Mahjong. Here's another virtual discovery tool. The Germans have had since 2005 something called Melville Search. That's a hierarchical browse of catalogs. And they wanted a similar thing as they're moving to the new MARC XML environment. And so did the Norwegians and the Swedes. And so collaboratively, they worked with the cooperation of OCLC on using the look and feel of Web Dewey to create a hierarchical browse that simply takes the Dewey numbers, captions, and says how many in this category and how many in classes below this. And they're going to add to this table notation as well. So it'll allow faceted browse, and keep that thought because I'll get to how could you possibly do that. And this is in a minute how you could possibly do it. So how many people in your life have been frustrated because the rules say to assign one number, and that's the right physical place, that's the right number according to the rules in that edition of the classification, but you really wanted to put something in two physical places. Well, now that we're in a virtual environment, a lot of library catalogs have browse the shelves. And why can't you browse virtual shelves? And so the 083 field is available now, and it is additional Dewey numbers, and in there you can put an additional full number, and you can also put an additional facet. So here was a book on stews and soups, and it was driven to have the number for stews, but why couldn't it be encountered with soups too? Now, remember I said earlier that the 765 field was exactly parallel to the 085 field in the bibliographic format? This is huge because we all have those 765 fields lurking in our classification data files, in our authority files for our classification. And we're looking at how we can enrich WorldCat data. DNB didn't wait for us. They took 500,000 records and enriched them with 083 and 085 records already, so they're in WorldCat. They're not going to be indexed till later this year, so they're in there, but if you say, she told me they were in there and I can't find them, they're not indexed yet, but we have ways of finding them. What this means is that you can answer an actual use case. When I was in Scotland, I'm talking to the Scottish Library and Information Council, they say, our real use cases, we're very geographically focused, and we don't care the language of cataloging, the language of the work. We want to know everything, for instance, about a particular place, where it exists. And so here's something, it's a cookbook written in German about the cookie of the Highlands, but you can get to that because you have the number from table 2, 4115 for the Highlands here. And it doesn't matter how that's represented in the German geographic subject headings. You have it here, buried in that number. So all of a sudden, the numbers are speaking. They're being pulled apart, and you're able to get at those facets. And the final thing I want to show you is I told you that we were working on 200 religion, and I told you that UDC, we had developed a top-level crosswalk between UDC religion and Dewey religion. And in the early 2000s, UDC upended the religion classification and introduced a chronological regional view of religion. And the former editor, Ian McElwain, and I worked on a project together to say, could we take that chronological regional view and make a crosswalk between Dewey? This is a Dewey view right now, and what do we notice? A lot of real estate in the linear notation to Christianity, 230 to 280 right there. And so what could we do if we upended the view of religion? And so this is a chronological regional view of religion. It's going to appear in print in that thing that's coming out next week. It doesn't look like this in print, but we're going to put it up with an API into worldcat.org, and we're also going to give instructions about how people can implement it in their local libraries as a browsing tool. So here, before we have Bible and Christianity as the first two elements, here we have prehistoric religions, religions of East and Southeast Asian origin. You're going down the list and say, what happened to Bible, Christianity? Where are they? Next page, here they are. They're in their chronological regional place, if you will. Basically, Islam, Babism, and Baha'i faith kind of stay in the same place. But if we go back here and we expand religions of East and Southeast Asian origin, you'll see what happens. So we're able to see religion in a different way. We're not changing all the numbers. We're keeping the notation. So each religion is still packed with its notation, and you don't need to change anything in the physical environment, but you can do this in the virtual environment. And it brings an entirely different viewpoint, a welcome viewpoint of chronology and region that doesn't privilege a particular religion. And so you can use this to launch a search into a catalog right from there. Well, ages ago, Aaron gave me like the 5-minute signal, and I think he knows now I have a very broad sense of 5 minutes. But I thought I would go back to where I started and just show this again, this picture of the Dewey ecosystem, so now you know what I was talking about, and give you a sense of the rich data that we have as Dewey data and the data that are linked to Dewey. And we didn't spend much time on categorized content, but that's a whole other talk of additional data linked to Dewey. And what I really want you to leave here with is thinking beyond just that iconic representation on a spine label in a physical space, and think about, what other things can we do with this data? What use cases have you thought about? What additional data transformations should we think about? What research would be very interesting to take place in this data environment? And with that, I will say thank you. And put up, I know you'll get access to my talk, and at the very end I have links to all sorts of resources, but now I'll just thank you and turn it open for questions and comments.
I was wondering, how long have the records, the authority records for the class numbers been around for?
We actually made a conversion in, time flies, in 2010. And we converted back to edition 20 So we have all that data, but we only cleaned up the records of edition 22 and 23 because we were pushing them out to the MARC XML. So, you know, there are things, everything is in MARC XML, is in the MARC classification authority formats that was previously in our proprietary format.
And are these formats available freely for consumption?
So let me see if I understand your question. I think what you're asking, are the data available freely for consumption? Is that your question?
Well, I'm interested in importing the MARC record into our database and doing something with it. So I'm kind of wondering if...
Oh, sure. Okay. So we don't push out the data just everywhere for people to consume it, but we would certainly entertain a research project. So, you know, we have research projects going on all around. So obviously that Web Dewey search was a research project that we made available as a product. What we make available just to everybody are the top 3 levels of the classification, the assignable numbers and captions from the abridged edition, and as soon as we productionize it, the assignable numbers and captions from the full edition. That's available under Creative Commons BY-NC-ND license, so it's attribution, non-commercial, no derivative works. But if you were at a library and say, boy, I'd really like to I'd like to figure out how I could improve our discovery experience for all ears. You know, one of our colleagues is at Drexel today talking with the Internet Public Library people about a possible project, and we shared some data with them to see what, you know, might come out of that.
I'm really excited to see these efforts because, and I wish my systems librarian colleague were here today because we have this ongoing debate whether we should put class numbers in our 092 for our e-resources. And I'm like, we should put it there. And he's like, why? It's not on the shelf. We should put it there. Yes. And the main reason is because a lot of these interfaces that we're using now do map to those numbers. So if we don't have the numbers, then we can't browse virtually, and you addressed that already.
Sure, and plus you get those facets too. I mean, this is like the hugest things because many years ago, a PhD student at UCLA, Shangquao Liu, did an amazing thesis on taking apart Dewey numbers automatically, but it predated the technology being there, the data being available that way. And you know, I just think that we have such an opportunity to improve discovery. I mean, one of my colleagues always gives the example of, you know, is Turkey in Asia or is Turkey in Europe? And, you know, what if you have part of it here and part of it there? Well, you know, you have some in the 4s and some in the 5s, but couldn't you just discover things in a different way now when you have your facets and when you bring in geocodes as yet another layer of how you organize things. So, yeah. So talk to me afterwards. Give me your card. Yes?
So do you foresee a time when you don't put the numbers together? That you keep them each separately? So in a sense, you're creating a set of fields, which you're doing, and you're making a number, especially with what you're saying about finding facets and all.
You know, I think that's a really good question, and I think that same question has been posed for things like if you look at FAST, the faceted access to subject terms at too. The numbers together give a summary of that, a pre-coordinated summary of what that's about. So if you take it apart, there's something lost without that pre-coordination. So I think we have the best of both worlds in being able to be able to have the number pre-coordinated and have the facets. But I think I'd like to go one step below your question and say, I think you said, do you ever see the time when you would stop putting them together? Do I see the time when maybe a person might stop putting them together? Yeah, I think so. You know, I think that would make sense. Any other questions? Yes.
Yeah, I just heard that the Dewey system has been used in the Netherlands to classify archival documents. So I was wondering if you, I'm interested in how we can use that in archival institutions and how widespread this has been?
Actually, I'm not aware of that because they have something, they have a general classification system called basis, their classification, and I wasn't aware that there had been an archival application. I would tell you that one thing you might look at is BASE at Bielefeld. The University of Bielefeld has a project, it's the Basic Academic Search Engine, and they've been assigning Dewey numbers to everything in their digital repository. So that's not the same as archival elements because they're, you know, you're thinking about creator, there's a lot of provenance, but there's geographic tables and there's identities of people in Dewey too. But I would urge you to take a look at Bielefeld's base. I didn't have time to talk about it today, but they're also doing automatic generation of Dewey numbers in that project using computational linguistics techniques, which, you know, when you look at archival elements, that could be very interesting. So, yeah. Yes?
Just wanted to say thank you because we really appreciate the support OCLC gives to our students, that they can get free access to WebDewey and all the other cataloging tools as well as a reference site as well. It's so good to be able to expose students to real-world systems at real-world scale instead of some little demo that really doesn't make them get into it. So you can't, well, you probably do understand, but it's really important to us and we really appreciate it, especially the free part.
Well, I'll take that back and I'll tell you something very important. One of the prompters for changing the WebDewey interface on a fast track, I mean, we wanted something that we could use with Dewey data encoded in MARC XML from any language, but somebody one day, a faculty member came to us and said, do you have any idea how bad your interface is? Like students get to it, the one that we had in Connection, and say, what is this? You know, they're not, because the web had come and they weren't used to that interface. And so we developed the WebDewey current interface very much based not on long-term practitioners in the field. We wanted to meet their needs, but very much based on comments back from students. So it works both ways too, and that's important for students to know. We do here.
We are coming up onto the hour, so maybe we can bring kind of the proceedings to an end. And if you have any questions you'd like to address with Joe afterwards, and we can talk to her on a one-to-one basis. But at the moment, thank you very much. That was a wonderful talk.
Thank you. Thank you for your attention and ideas.